Is it what? I know, I know. I made sure it was actually working. I'm getting slowly but surely I'm getting better with technology. I'm not I'm one of the people in my generation you do not want to if something's wrong with your phone, something's wrong with your car, you don't want to ask me. I don't know. Someone at McDonald's the other day was like, "Hey, do you know what this means?" Because he was trying to figure something out with a SIM card, and I was like, "I have no idea." And I wanted to be like, there was a bunch of like high schoolers. I wanted to be like, just go ask them. So yeah, right, right. Go ask my daughter. She's 8 months, but she probably can figure it out faster than me. We go tomorrow. All right. 15-word essay. I hope I can do that in 30 minutes. I have done that before. I actually have done that before. I don't advise it. It was an accident. I didn't realize the paper was due that day, but it was over. Fortunately, I knew something about the topic, and it was in my undergrad, and I was like, oh no, the paper's due today, and it was just like a 5-page paper, and so I quickly went to the library. It was over the Gnostic Gospels, so I quickly went to the library, wrote 5 pages in about like 15 minutes because I had a class coming up. So then I went to class, and then the class after was when I had to turn in the paper, and I went and turned in the paper. I made like a 95. I was very proud of myself. Like I said, fortunately, I knew about the topic already, so I just came up with an argument and then just found quotes in the book to make the argument. So I did the same thing actually in masters. Yeah, I had like I think a 10 to 15 page paper, and I wrote in like 2 hours. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, we'll just do this. It was over charisma. It was over that idea, which I can't even remember what that exactly is. But I wrote it. All right, let's pray, and then let us begin and continue talking about Luke. Dear Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for this time that we have to learn about the Gospel of Luke. Please help us, Lord, understand your word and help us put it into practice. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so the last 2 weeks we've been covering Luke chapters 1 through 18. And the end of 18 is when Bartimaeus receives his sight. So Jesus actually heals a blind man. And that leads into chapter 19. And we're going to be finishing Luke today. So we're going to be doing 19 through 24. And the beginning of 19 is a very famous story. It's about Zacchaeus. Verse 2, it says in 19, and there was a man called by the name of Zacchaeus. He was the chief tax collector, and he was rich. Zacchaeus was trying to see who Jesus was and was unable because of the crowd, because he was small in stature. And so he ran ahead, climbed into a sycamore tree in order to see him, for he was about to pass through that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up, said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for today I must stay at your house. And he hurried and came down and received him gladly. When they saw it, they all began to grumble, saying, he has gone to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. Zacchaeus stopped and said to the Lord, behold, Lord, half of my possessions I will give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will give it back 4 times as much. And Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost. So chapter 19, as we just read, it begins with the story of Zacchaeus, and Zacchaeus is converted, and he was a tax collector, which means that he would have been hated by his fellow Jews because he was a Jew taking money from them to give to Rome. And Jesus finds him hiding in a tree. Well, not hiding in a tree, but he's climbed up in a tree so he could see Jesus. And Jesus goes to his house, and Zacchaeus, we just read, actually calls him Lord. Verse 8, behold, Lord, half of my possessions. And he is willing to repay everyone he has defrauded and stolen from, and he's also giving his money to the poor. And Jesus remarks that salvation has found Zacchaeus' household. And then Jesus says a very, I think, amazing sentence that says, for the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost. So Jesus came to the lost so they could actually be found. After that, you have the parable of money usage, and this is a parable about how we are to be good stewards with what God has given us. More will be given to the good stewards, and those who are not good and use what God has given them well, if they use it worthlessly, then it will actually be taken away from it. It's a good practical idea of whatever God has given you, you need to take care of it, and you need to make sure you're using it correctly. Right, whether that means house, car, money, whatever it is, you want to be a good steward with what God has actually given you. And then in the next section after that, you actually have Luke's triumphal entry. So this is when Jesus is entering Jerusalem on the colt of a donkey, and people are praising Jesus when he enters, but the Pharisees actually do not like it. And Jesus said if the people did not praise him and cry out, then creation would cry out. Yet when Jesus saw Jerusalem, he cries because he knows what will happen in the future. The temple is going to be destroyed in about 40 years, and Jerusalem would be attacked, all because they do not realize who Jesus is, and they reject Jesus, and therefore God is actually going to reject them. It's really interesting. R.C. Sproul wrote a book called... oh goodness, what is it? The Donkey Who Jesus Rode Upon or something. It's for it's a child's book, and it's about the donkey that Jesus rode on for the triumphal entry. And if I remember correctly, at least the portion that I've read to Hattie was about servanthood and about the donkey kind of got puffed up because a king rode him, and now he's like out doing menial labor. And he's like, why am I doing this? Like, I'm a better donkey than other donkeys. Why am I carrying these loads? But anyway, I just was reading that to Hattie earlier this week, and so it was in my mind. I can't remember. I want to say it's the donkey that Jesus rode or the king rode or something like that. It's by R.C. Sproul. So if you guys want to look it up for grandchildren, there you go. And then after the triumphal entry, Jesus then drives the merchants out of the temple, and he also taught daily in the temple, and his enemies wanted to destroy him, but they couldn't find anything against him, and the people, of course, liked Jesus, even though his enemies feared the people, so they didn't really want to do anything, at least in front of them. One of the things, though, that I find interesting, when it says that, let me see if I can find it. Yeah, the last verse. They could not find anything that they might do, for all the people were hanging on to every word he said. There's other passages that seem to imply the same thing, but also seem to say that they couldn't find anything against him, of course, and we know that's true because Jesus is sinless, right? He's perfect. A lot of people nowadays, it's really interesting, they'll say Jesus is a rebel. That's not really true. He wasn't actually rebelling, because someone who rebels is usually someone breaking the law, and if Jesus is perfect, then he couldn't have actually broken the law. What he was telling the Pharisees is that they weren't actually following the law like they thought they were. So if you ever hear someone say Jesus was a rebel, that's not actually true. Jesus was not a rebel. He's God. I don't know who he's going to rebel against except himself then, because he's the one in authority. But I've heard that before, and there's sometimes very popular songs about how Jesus was a rebel, and I'm like, that's just not theologically accurate. Jesus is sinless and he's perfect, so he's not a rebel. He was just explaining to the Pharisees why they were wrong, and technically why they were in rebellion, but they did not want to listen to him. But you see in verse 48 of chapter 19 that they couldn't do anything, and Luke explains, for all the people were hanging on to every word he said. So they were afraid of the people. So it's part of why when they do actually get Jesus arrested, when they arrest him, they do it secretly. They didn't do it in an open space. So now in chapter 20, as Jesus was teaching one day, the priests and the scribes confronted him and asked who gave him his authority. And Jesus said that he would tell them if they would answer whether John the Baptist came from heaven or from man. Basically, did God send John the Baptist? That's really what he's asking. And the enemies of Jesus refused to answer, again, because in verse 6 it says, "But if we say from men, all the people will stone us to death, for they are convinced that that John was a prophet." So again, it shows that they were afraid of the people. And so they refused to answer, and so Jesus then refuses to answer them. It's really interesting that they're asking this authority because he's been doing miracles his entire ministry, so you'd think they would understand where his authority is coming from, but they're willfully rejecting the truth. They don't want to believe it. Jesus then tells a parable about vine growers who are renting a vineyard from a man, and the man returns from his journey, and so he sends a slave at excuse me. He sends a slave at harvest time so he can get the produce that's his, and the men beat the slave and they send him away with nothing. And so the owner then sends another slave and the same thing happens, and then he sent a third and the renters beat that one too and sent him away. And so the owner finally sends his son, and the renters decide to kill the son to take his inheritance. And Jesus asked the people, "What will the owner do?" And then Jesus answers his own question and says that he would destroy the renters and give the vineyard to others. This story is about the Israelites and the religious leaders, right? They're rejecting Jesus, and so he would allow others into the kingdom of God, which would be Gentiles. So you can kind of picture the slaves kind of like as the prophets of Old Testament times, right? God keeps sending people over and over and over again, and they keep rejecting, and so eventually he sends his son, and they kill his son. And so because they're rejecting the son, and they actually kill the son, at least in the story, and of course what actually happens with Jesus is that he's killed, God is going to reject them, and he's going to allow others to actually join into the kingdom of God, which is a great thing for us because as far as I know, we're probably all Gentiles, and we're the ones that get to be added into. So that's what this parable is explaining. And then Luke recounts the story of how Jesus taught that we should give to God what is God's, but we should also obey our nation's laws and give to them what they ask. And in this case, it's taxes. I know that's not anything that any of us want to hear, but technically we are supposed to obey our nation's laws and we are supposed to pay our taxes. Jesus unfortunately does say this right here for us. It's 19 through I think 26, 19 through 26 on Luke 20. That's the passage. And then Jesus tells the people of the resurrection and that the resurrection is true. And he's doing this because some of the Sadducees were asking about the resurrection, and the Sadducees were a group of religious leaders that did not believe in a bodily resurrection. The Pharisees believed that in the afterlife, people would be resurrected. The Sadducees did not believe that. And this is why he's asking the question, or answering the question. And so he's telling people that the resurrection in the afterlife, it is actually true. And he does this by answering, again, the question from the Sadducees. And he tells them that God is the God of the living, not the dead, and he uses Exodus 3. So in verse 28, Jesus says, they say, "Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies having a wife and he is childless, his brother should marry the wife and raise up children to his brother." And then they tell this story where they say there's 7 brothers, and the first one took a wife and he died childless, and so the second brother marries her and he dies, and then it continues on. And then they say, okay, so in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? And Jesus says, the sons of this age, this is in verse 34, the sons of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy to attain to that age in the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage, for they cannot even die anymore because they are like angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. It says they are like angels, meaning that they don't get married because angels don't get married. It's not saying that we turn into angels, just so you guys know. And then in verse 37, but that the dead are raised, even Moses showed in the passage about the burning bush, where he calls the Lord the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. Now he is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for all live to him. And so Jesus responds by reminding them of Exodus 3 and the burning bush, where Moses is told by God that he is the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. He is the God of the living. He is not the God of the dead. He is also the God of the Jews. And so Jesus then warns the people against the scribes, against the Sadducees, against the Pharisees. Okay, so that's what happens. That's what happens in Luke chapter 20. Any questions about 19 and 20? Or any comments or anything you guys want to talk about before we continue? Okay. That jacket is throwing me off, Larry, because it's like the exact kind of jacket I would see in Kansas City with like the Kansas City Chiefs. And so I'm like, is he a Chiefs fan? I'm like, that's weird. I'm glad you're not a Chiefs fan. All right, so chapter 21, Luke is telling the story of the widow giving all that she has into the treasury, and Jesus praises her for it. It's not the amount that matters, but the heart behind the gift. Now, there's actually two ways of taking this passage, and I didn't actually know that until I was listening to John MacArthur, I believe, and Justin Peters. And so in 21 it says, he looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasure, and he saw a poor widow putting into copper small coins. And he said, truly I say to you, this poor widow put in more than all of them, for they out of their surplus put into the offering, but she out of the poverty put in all that she had to live on. And what's interesting is that when you look at other gospels, when this story is actually taking place, and even somewhat in this one, in Luke chapter 20, starting in verse 46, when Jesus is telling the disciples and the people to actually watch out for the scribes and the Pharisees, he says, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love respectful greetings in the marketplaces and chief seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. And then this is the key phrase right here, who devour widows' houses. And for appearance sake, offer long prayers. These will receive greater condemnation. Now, remember, in the original, there are no chapters and verses. So it then continues, and he looked up and saw the rich putting in their gifts into the treasure, and then he saw a poor widow putting in 2 small copper coins. So the context is Jesus actually just saying, beware of the scribes and the Pharisees. And part of what he's saying is beware of the Pharisees' teaching of people, in a sense, giving things, and they're actually devouring widows' houses. Instead of helping the widows, they're basically taking the money from the widows. And then he looks up and he sees a widow giving literally everything she has. And so the way that some people take this is that Jesus isn't necessarily praising her, but more like another condemnation for the Pharisees, saying this is an example of what I was basically just talking about, of a widow actually giving all she has when she shouldn't be needing to do that, because the scribes, the Pharisees, the people that are supposed to be in charge are supposed to be taking care of the widows. That's what's in the law. So there's 2 ways that people have taken that. I was always taught that he was saying she did a really good job until I heard that, and I'm not sure necessarily what to think about it, but I wanted to tell you guys that there is another view out there that's more like another condemnation against the scribes and the Pharisees if you don't break it up by the chapter and you actually just read it immediately after in the context. So anyway, there's that idea as well. And then Jesus explains that in the coming days, the temple is going to be torn down, which does happen in 70 AD. And he continues and he warns his disciples again against false teachers and that they should not be afraid of wars and disturbances, because that is the beginning of the end. The end will come and there will be much strife and tribulation. Christians will be persecuted, but Jesus is going to help them. And he specifically is talking to the disciples here, however, but the idea really does apply also to Christians today. And there's going to be signs of Jesus' return, and we need to be discerning, and we need to be on guard and waiting, but also alert and in prayer. I remember last week we were talking somewhat about this, and I mentioned that I had just listened to Sinclair Fergus Ferguson preach on the last days, the last things, I think was actually what the title was. And he made an interesting point that obviously we don't know when Jesus is going to return, but when he does return, you can eventually look back and see what the signs were. And it's not, we need to be paying attention to the signs, but it's not necessarily easy because Jesus is saying this 2,000 years ago, and technically we've been in the last days for over 2,000 years. And so there have always basically been wars and rumors of war and strife and persecution for Christians. So when it comes to the last days, you would think there would at least be more, possibly, but it could be difficult to completely figure it out until it actually happens, and then you could actually look back and be like, oh, okay, these were the actual specific signs that are being talked about. Which is, I think, a fair point. It's food for thought. One of the things that is rather interesting, at least to me, is that almost every single generation thinks that they're in the last, in the final days. And so I think it kind of goes to the point of we do need to be ready, we do need to be on guard, because we don't know when he is going to return. And so I think the point is that, whether we truly believe that we are in the final days or not, we should live in a sense like we're in the final days and actually go out and evangelize and be reading your Bible and trying to disciple just like we're supposed to be doing, and not just wait and be complacent in our walk with God, but be active in it. I think that's the point that should be made, practically speaking. Theologically speaking, I think there's a lot of points you can make, and some of it is probably debatable because, again, we just don't know when he's going to return. So, anything about chapter 21? Anything about that? A lot of times people like to talk about the end days, usually because we don't know what's going to happen. I always like to say by the time it happens, we probably won't care who was right or wrong. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I remember, I can't remember where I heard it, but I mean, thinking about World War I and World War II and the Third Reich and everything, and people it was really bad back then. Yeah, exactly. The Depression, and then you have the Nazis, and then you have communism, and yeah. So one of the interesting things, though, is Jesus says, I can't remember if he says it in this one, that he says that only that God knows, or the Father knows when he's actually going to come back. And some people like to point out and say, oh yeah, see, that shows that Jesus doesn't actually know everything, but that's not actually the point. Because you have to remember that Jesus had two natures. He is fully God as well as fully man. So obviously in his divinity, as God, he does know when he would return, but as a man, he did not, and the Father did not give him that knowledge as a man. And so that's actually how you should read that passage. It's not that Jesus doesn't actually know something that the Father's the only one that knows, because Jesus is God, therefore he's omniscient, therefore he would know it. So there's that. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. There will be signs in sun and moon and stars, and on the earth dismay among nations and perplexity at the roaring of the sea and the waves, men fainting from fear and the expectation of the things which are coming upon the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. I didn't know that, actually. I didn't know that those two verses specifically were unique to Luke. That's interesting. It is. It is. Mm-hmm. I think they are. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, this verse actually it it seems very similar to Acts chapter 2. Um, Verses 19 and 20. This is Peter in his sermon on Pentecost, and he's quoting the prophet Joel about the last days, actually. And he quotes Joel, and I think it's Joel chapter 2. I want to say it's like 20, 26, 27, something like I can't remember. But it says, "And I will grant wonders in the sky above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. The sun will be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and glorious day of the Lord shall come," which is again talking about the last times, the last days. So it seems that there's a connection. So he's saying it here, and what is it? 18, 19. Oh, in Acts chapter 2 or Joel? Oh, Acts chapter 2, yeah. It's I read 19 and 20. Technically, it goes from 17 to 21. That's what he's quoting from Joel chapter 2. But yeah, there seems to be a connection there. When you're reading about the last days, it talks a lot about the signs, and it talks about the sun and the moon and darkness and certain things like that. And it's supposed to be kind of like a fearful time. Now, obviously, for Christians, it could be a time of joy because we're going to be saved, and if you believe in the rapture, you'll be taken up to heaven. If you don't believe in the rapture, then eventually you would die, or Jesus would return, and then either way you go up. And I don't think it's worth really getting into debate about all of those things. It's an interesting conversation, but yeah, there seems to be a lot of signs and wonders that we do need to be discerning about, or at least try to be discerning about, and look in the world and see what's happening in the world. But we also have to, again, take it, I don't want to say with a grain of salt, but we do need to be humble about it because, again, most people have always thought that they're in the last days. So, well, not the last, but like the final days. So have your beliefs about the end times. I think it was my pastor in Kansas City who basically was like, hold your beliefs in one hand, but have humility, because you could technically be wrong about the end times because we don't completely know. So you should know what you believe, and you should be convicted about it, and it's okay. But if the person next to you disagrees with it and it's not heretical, it's fine to disagree and be like, you know what? When we're both in heaven, we can figure out who's right. As long as they're going to heaven with you, I think that it's an area that you can disagree on with believers and be perfectly fine. So, but no, thank you for pointing that out. I did not know 25 and 26 was unique to Luke. So, all right. So now chapter 22. So in this chapter, you immediately have in verse 3 Satan entering Judas Iscariot. And Judas goes off to betray Jesus for money. And the chapter is also discussing the last Passover and the Lord's Supper, and both relate back to the first Passover in Egypt when the Israelites were about to leave the land, and the last plague of Egypt occurred where the firstborn were killed. And Jesus sends Peter and John to find a room for the Passover and prepare it, and then at the Passover meal, Jesus tells the disciples that this is going to be the last Passover he's going to take until he comes again. And he's not going to eat or drink until after his second coming. And then he passes out the drink and the bread that represent his blood and his body that we take, and that it was killed, of course, for us. The body of Jesus was beaten and killed for us. And Jesus also warns against his betrayer, and the disciples are actually confused. This is another area where the disciples did not understand that Judas was actually going to betray Jesus. And what's interesting is right after you're doing the Lord's Supper, and he's explaining what's going to happen to them, they immediately began to dispute about who's the greatest among them. And Jesus then explains that the greatest is a servant, and the disciples need to act like servants in the kingdom of God. And Jesus does tell of blessings for the disciples who are going to be faithful, and that they will sit on thrones and judge the tribes of Israel. So they will actually be blessed, and they will be rewarded for their faithfulness. But then he continues, and he explains to his disciples that he is going to be counted among sinners, and we are sinners, and for our salvation, Jesus was considered one of us, even though he is not. And then they all go up, all the disciples, and they go to Gethsemane, and Jesus goes away from himself, and he prays, and he wants his disciples to pray, but instead they fall asleep. And Jesus is then betrayed by Judas, and he is arrested, and one of his disciples attacks the Jewish high priest's slave, which, let me see if I find, I don't think it actually says it here, but I think it says it in another one. I forget which one it is, but forget which gospel, but I'm pretty sure it's Peter who actually does it. Peter cuts off the high priest's slave's ear, and then Jesus heals it and puts it back on him. And that's always been a really odd thing to me, because they're coming to arrest Jesus, and one of his disciples literally attacks one of them, and Jesus heals them, literally shows compassion, doesn't have to, because he's being arrested, and he literally does a healing in front of all of them, and they just don't care. It just baffles me. Like, it's like, how disconnected are they from the truth? Yeah, it's like, it's just a really shocking thing, because he immediately just then goes with the soldiers and the priests, and he allows himself to be arrested. You'd think that someone would be like, wait a minute, okay, we're coming to arrest this guy, and he literally just healed this person in front of us who was literally his enemy. Like, shouldn't we stop and think about this for a moment? But no. Is really what happened. Yeah, I think that's what, they're blinded. Yeah. So Jesus is the house of the high priest. This is where Peter then denies Christ 3 times. Once he does this, he reads what Jesus said, and he goes off and he cries. And Jesus is mocked, and he is beaten by blasphemous men. Sanhedrin, which is the Jewish council, and they ask Jesus, the Son of God, and he actually says he is, claiming to be messianic and deific title son. He claims it through saying he's the Son of Man, which is a title for God and all. And the council claim that they don't need anything more to condemn him because he's claimed to be God, and so for them that is, of course, blasphemy. Which to their Jesus really wasn't God. That was blasphemous. So to their, if you think about it that way, it is what they're doing, not necessarily what they're doing is correct on the mocking and eating, but they are trying to stand up for what is technically true, rejecting Jesus, who is actually God, and they're not seeing. I do want to give credit to the Pharisees and the scribes, like where do, and technically they were trying to stand up for the right thing. The problem is that they didn't realize that Jesus was actually the right. So continuing on in chapter 23, we have Luke recounting Jesus standing before Pilate and standing before Herod, and people are claim that Jesus is misleading Israel as well and the King of the Jews. Jesus, if he is the king, and Jesus responds that he is. In verse 3, they asked him, saying, "Are you the King of the Jews?" And he answered and said, "It is as you say." And so Pilate finds no reason to kill him, but the people refuse to. And then Pilate, once he is actually from Herod's jurisdiction is basically like, oh, okay, I can just send him off to Herod down on this. And so he does. And so Herod finally gets to meet Jesus. And he meets Jesus for a very long time. He had Jesus' cousin killed, John the Baptist. And he hears about it, the disciples going out and healing people. And he hears a little bit of afraid because he's like, is back from that. So he's been hearing about Jesus and he wants to meet him. And it's interesting because Jesus just flat out just refuses to talk to him, doesn't respond at all. And throughout, the priests and the scribes are just continuing. And so Herod, along with his soldiers, mock Jesus, and then Herod just sends him. And Pilate tries to release Jesus of a beating, not with death. But again, claiming that they would rather have another man released instead of Jesus, because it was the custom at the Passover to release a prisoner. And so Pilate according to what the people want, and he delivers Jesus into their hands to be crucified. And the people are literally crying out multiple times for Jesus to be crucified, and this is rather because it's really harsh language. You don't just yell out crucify, crucify at that time. Extremely harsh, almost like vulgar language, what they're yelling. Very uncommon for the day. Crucifixion, of course, was in fact, so bad that they actually had to come up with a word to describe the pain because there was no word. The pain that you have, what the word is? Excruciating. It comes from the same word. They literally made up a word for the pain on a crucifixion because there was no word to describe the pain. So it's basically like the pain of being crucified. So Jesus is condemned at the crucifixion. And like all, he has to carry his cross up the hill, but he cannot actually in the beating. And so a man named Simon of Cyrene carries Jesus. Now, the reason why they give the name, if anyone asks, it can be, why can I not think of the word? Corroborated. You go find Simon of Cyrene and be like, hey, did you actually carry this guy's cross? And he'd be like, yeah, I did. I carried the beam for him. So that's why the name is there. And so Simon of Cyrene carries the beam for Jesus, and a large crowd is following, and there's women mourning. And Jesus speaks to them and tells them not to cry for him, but for themselves. And his reason is because Jesus actually knows that bad times are coming. It says in 29, or I'll start in 28, daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry? If I remember correctly, I'm pretty sure this has to do with the destruction of Jerusalem. It's looking ahead to that time. So, Jesus is crucified between two criminals. One of the criminals mocks him and abuses him, and the other tells him to stop, and he actually recognizes that Jesus is innocent, and he asks Jesus to remember him, and Jesus responds that he would be with him in paradise. Now, it's really interesting because not all the Gospels actually give the story of the one criminal actually realizing who Jesus is. So I can't remember, but I know obviously it's in Luke, but not all the Gospels tell of the one criminal who actually did, in a sense, actually acknowledge who Jesus was, and in a sense repent and confess and say, like, I deserve to be up here. Now, so Jesus is crucified, and as he is crucified and hanging on the tree, he is mocked. And the Romans also put the crime above his head on the cross, and it says that he is the king of the Jews, which is correct. If you look at the genealogy of Jesus, he is actually the rightful king of the Jews. I know I've talked about that before, and so I don't need to go back in there, but if you look at the genealogies in Luke as well as Matthew, and you connect it, he is actually the king of the Jews, just genealogically speaking, not even theologically speaking, but so there is that fact. At noon, darkness fell over the land, and it lasted until 3 p.m., and during this time, the veil between the Holy of Holies and the other section of the temple was torn, indicating that people no longer needed a priest and they could go to God through Jesus. And at that time, Jesus cried out for the Father to receive him, and he willingly died. A Roman soldier witnesses this event, and he realized who Jesus was, and many people saw Jesus' death, and they were saddened by it. And Jesus is then taken off the cross and buried by Joseph of Arimathea, who was a member of the Sanhedrin, and he was buried in Joseph's tomb. And Jesus was prepared and wrapped in a linen cloth, placed in the tomb. And the women who followed Jesus saw where he was buried and were going to return later with spices. And then it was the Sabbath, and so they rested. Okay? Now in chapter 24, the final chapter of Luke, this retells the historical event of Jesus' resurrection. So on the first day of the week, Jesus rose again, and the women who prepared the spices came to put them on Jesus' body. However, at the tomb, they found the stone rolled away and the tomb empty. And they witnessed 2 angels telling them to remember what Jesus had said, and that he would have to die, be crucified, and on the 3rd day rise again. And the women then remembered Jesus' words. And it's important to note that women were the first witnesses of the empty tomb. Because in those days, women were not seen as credible witnesses. So if someone was going to make up a story, they wouldn't put women as the witnesses. They would have put men. So it's important that the women were the first ones to find it, because it shows the authenticity of the story. And Luke isn't, of course, the only one who does this. I'm fairly certain all the Gospels say that women saw the empty tomb first. Mary Magdalene was the first person to see Jesus, but women were the first ones who saw the empty tomb. Yeah, but Mary Magdalene, who was, of course, a woman, was the first one to see Jesus alive. Yes. Which, again, if you're going to make up the story, you wouldn't make it Mary Magdalene. Yeah, so the story goes is that I'm pretty sure they ran back to tell the disciples, and I think Peter and John, they run ahead and they see the empty tomb, and Mary Magdalene, I think, followed. And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, I think they leave and Mary Magdalene is still there, and that's when Jesus appears to her. I think, if I'm remembering the correct timeline of events, I'm pretty sure that's how it works. Huh? Yeah, I think that's how it goes. So the women leave, they find the disciples, tell them what happened, and the disciples didn't believe, but Peter gets up and runs to the tomb, and John, of course, follows, and they saw what the women saw, that the tomb was empty and the linen clothes remained. And then Luke jumps to a story of 2 people who believed that Jesus, who did believe in Jesus, and they were traveling to Emmaus, which is a town 7 miles from Jerusalem. And Jesus shows up, and he just starts walking with them. And the 2 men are talking about what had just happened. And when Jesus appears, they don't recognize him, and he asks what they're talking about. And so the men begin to tell them of Jesus, the crucifixion, and that his body was gone from his tomb. And the men are confused, and so Jesus, beginning with Moses, begins to explain the scriptures to them concerning himself. And then they neared the village of Emmaus, and Jesus stays with them. And at the table before the food, Jesus takes the bread and blesses it. And then the eyes of the disciples are opened, and the 2 men recognize who Jesus is. And then Jesus suddenly vanishes. And the 2 immediately return to Jerusalem and tell the story to the disciples that Jesus is alive and that they had seen him. I think that's a great story. So many people, they're always like, man, I want to be those 2 men. Imagine that amazing Bible study that they had about the Old Testament. And so while the men are actually telling the disciples, Jesus then appears before them all. And the disciples are, of course, afraid at the beginning because they thought they're seeing a ghost. And yet Jesus comforts them, and he shows them his hands, shows them his feet, proving to them who he is. And the disciples and the others are amazed, and then Jesus eats before them. And then Jesus again explains how all of this had to be done to fulfill prophecy, reminding them of his words. And then their minds are opened up, and they begin to understand the scriptures. And Jesus tells them again of the prophecy of his death and resurrection, and he reminded them again that they're going to be witnesses of these events. And the last part of Luke shows Jesus leading his disciples to the village of Bethany and blessing them, and then he ascends into heaven, and the disciples witness it, and they worship Jesus. And after that event, they return to Jerusalem and were continually praising God. I'll just read the very last 50 to 53. And so he led them out as far as Bethany, and he lifted up his hands and blessed them. While he was blessing them, he parted from them and was carried up into heaven. And they, after worshiping him, returned to Jerusalem with great joy and were continually in the temple praising God. And so that is how Luke ends his gospel to Theophilus. Next week, we'll begin Acts, and it continues that story. It picks up exactly where the gospel leaves off, with the ascension of Jesus and then leading into Pentecost. So, any questions, comments, anything about the Gospel of Luke? Well, I guess that makes sense because I didn't have telephones or telegraph back then. You know, the fastest way to your house at this moment is probably walking, Larry. So, anything about Luke? All right. Well, thank you guys. As I said, next week we're going to be talking about Acts, and we're going to be talking about Acts for the next, I want to say 3 weeks. I believe it's 3 weeks, and we're going to be finishing on December 1st. I think that'll be a good time to finish because that's when everything really starts getting busy. So, because there's going to be the holidays and everything coming up. So, all right. Does anyone want to close us in prayer?